Our next speaker is Reza Hasmath, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. His talk today draws from his SSHRC Insight Development Grant project and is titled The NGO and the State in China. Reza.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to move from Canada across the Pacific to China. And we're going to start off with a very humble sort of problem, at least a humble problem in my eyes. The idea here is this. What we see here is that the state is experiencing a sort of drawback in its sort of resources for servicing social welfare. Then we have NGOs who have the capacity to service these particular constituents. So the problem, which I said was, at least in my eyes, is very humble. Why don't we see a lot of collaboration between the state and the NGO? On the one hand, we have the NGO with the capacity, the state's retreating. It kind of makes sense that they actually interact with each other. So when I look at the literature to explain why we don't see a lot of collaboration between the state and the NGO, one of the major things that we saw in the literature was that because of the domination of the state, we're not actually seeing a lot of actors wanting to collaborate with them. In fact, they're afraid to collaborate with the state. So a lot of the literature talks about that. Another explanation is organizational differences between both sectors. So simply put, when you see the state, for instance, the state has a different way of behaving, a different sort of organizational culture, different ways of processing and thinking than, say, the NGO, who has another form of organizational culture. And so ultimately, when you have two different entities, two different sectors who think differently, have different organizational cultures, it's very difficult for them to work with each other. So that's what we saw in the literature. What my research suggests is a really interesting sort of idea. After speaking to government officials, speaking to NGO officials in China, and in various local jurisdictions in China, and with great geographical representativity, what was really fascinating is that local officials, local policy officials, did not actually have meaningful awareness of an NGO. In fact, many did not actually meaningfully know what an NGO does. And so how can they partner with an entity if they know very little about it? And so that was the sort of highlight that the research that I did on this project suggested. Now, what are the implications of this? And I think this is what's really interesting for me. When the state is aware of the NGO, they're after the material power. So NGOs have various powers. They have material power, they have symbolic power, geographical power, interpretive power. But when public officials were aware of what the NGO can do for them, they were interested in how can they utilize their material power. In other words, how can they utilize their money? And so that was kind of an interesting sort of observation there. Another way to actually engineer sort of relationships with the state is actually at the personal level. What we saw here was throughout our various sort of field sites is that when NGO officials were either ex-government officials or had close personal relationships with the government, they're more likely to engage with them. Mind you, the caveat being is it's a one-off project that you saw that they would engage in. There was never a sort of long-term programmatic sort of project. And I guess the last sort of implications, and this is actually my new SSHRC-funded project. This is my old one, actually. And the new one is looking at these Chinese NGOs are going out now. So they're not, so it's really interesting because imagine you're an NGO who were born in an authoritarian environment. You have to learn the rules and behavior of the authoritarian environment to survive. But now you're going abroad to Myanmar, to Vietnam, to Ethiopia, to Tanzania. How are you going to engage in these jurisdictions who have a very different type of rules? Moreover, there's established Western NGOs there. So that's the sort of work that I'm looking at right now. And I think there's implications for Canada, obviously. As we start funding more and more projects overseas, we're going to start competing with the Chinese and their different styles. So that's the sort of work that I'm working on right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza.